Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective. Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Peter Fanger, and joining me today is Charlie Dixon. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Peter, how are you?
Doing well. Well, I'm excited because today is another episode of BHT Bytes, where we'll break down mental health and societal trends into quick, digestible conversations. So I'll start. Most folks don't get into mental health because we love chasing down CE credits. But every year, here we go again, scrambling to meet licensure requirements, clicking through long webinars, or blocking off entire weekends for training that may not actually feel relevant for work. For a lot of mental health practitioners, continuing education looks more like sitting in front of a screen, passively watching slides or reading dense materials after a full day of seeing clients. And the reality is that model just doesn't fit in many of our lives anymore, especially with full caseloads, documentation, and, actual lives. At the same time, many of us are already learning all the time. We listen to podcasts on our commute, between sessions, or while walking the dog. We're engaging in thoughtful clinical conversations, evidence-based ideas, and real-world perspectives. So on today's BHT Bytes, I'd love to talk about this growing shift in continuing education, earning CE credits through podcasts, what it actually means, how it works, who's it for, how clinicians can turn something they're already doing into legitimate, accredited professional development without adding one more thing to fit their to-do list. Bit of a sidebar here. As the show's producer and co-host, I like to think about this podcast feature and new ways to serve our listeners who are professional clinicians. So a topic like podcast-based CEs interested me. So I want to start a bit at the top. When people hear CE credits for podcasts, what is it? Well, simply put, it's a podcast-based CE that works similarly to a self-paced CE course. But in this case, the content will be around listening to podcast. So the podcast is the delivery method, but the CE credit is earned through an accredited platform, not necessarily like the podcast listening app. The process looks like a user will sit down and listen to a podcast-based CE on either a learning management system or an online learning platform. The content might be organized with the host presenting the evidence-based and cited materials to set up the topic. A guest might come on in an interview-style discussion to discuss their real-life experience, and the host might add additional perspective on that topic. The host is really taking the responsibility to make sure that the content aligns with accreditation from CE boards. After you've listened to the podcast, there'll be a post-test to test comprehension, usually a 70 to 80% passing score. And finally, after the completion of a successful passing score, you'll complete a course evaluation and download your certificates. Most podcast CE episodes are about 60 minutes long for 1 hour of CE credit, but this can also vary. The delivery of CE content in this way helps offer a flexible delivery where folks can learn during in-between moments, like I mentioned, walks or commutes and chores. This style of CE can be more engaging as conversational learning versus something more self-paced and a slide-based webinars. Ultimately, this offers an alternative to obtaining CE credits and can help reduce burnout. So I'd like to turn it around and ask you, Shirley, do you have any past experience with podcast-based CEs? Or did you have any assumptions about podcast-based CEs before learning about this?
You know what, Peter? I really don't have any experience with this. And when you mentioned that this is something you wanted to talk about, I was kind of thinking in the back of my mind, like, how credible is this? Like, are
Sure.
these real CE credits that people can earn? I am somebody who listens to podcasts, and I guess I wouldn't say it's like a continuing education type thing, but it's more like a learning experience because I do sit back and think, that's interesting. Let me research this some more, or maybe I can bring these topics up with the coworker. So I really didn't know that I could take something that I already do and use it to gain CE credits. So I'm very intrigued by the idea of it because again, this is something that a lot of us do. You mentioned, that commute. I sometimes am in my car an hour or more one direction and could definitely use that towards something more productive. On walks that I take, just my self-care type of things or while my children are at a practice. So I think that it's a very interesting idea. It's something that is different. And the way that things have traditionally been done with CEs it's not always that interesting or creative. And so I think that this provides an alternative to what we've been doing for years. And again, I'm kind of bad at this, waiting to the last minute to be like, oh my God, let me see what thing I can read or what slide presentation I can, flip through.
Sure.
And a lot of times they're not necessarily relevant, but this brings together two things, or one thing that I have to have, I need it, and then something that I enjoy, which is listening to podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, I do think that there is a level of enjoyment that comes with this, but I
Mhm.
also see as we've worked in this space of continuing education and the extended tried brands. I have seen the boards sort of loosen up on what they're qualifying as experts. Now, that's not to say that
Mhm.
these podcasts are not with two professionally qualified folks with credentials, but we've also seen people with lived experience also qualify for CE hours. And so, even as we see the scope of continuing education, it's starting to broaden and the types of content that's delivered. I know that there are other companies that sort of pride themselves on being able to deliver different kinds of CE credit. I don't know if you're familiar with CE Creations, but that is one where they try to anchor themselves on trying to deliver a different type of CE topics. It includes maybe like a
Yeah.
poem or somebody reading a book. It just goes beyond maybe the normal delivery of CE content. And I think it starts to push against maybe the foundation that we've seen. So a format like podcast-based CEs is really welcome. You even
Mhm.
mentioned it there that it just sort of fits with people's lives a little bit
Yeah.
differently than maybe like sitting at a computer and going through like a self-paced
Yes.
workshop where there's slides involved. So I know we talked a little bit about this traditional self-study CE courses, and
Mhm.
when we often think about recorded webinars or reading heavy course materials or static presentations, the podcast-based CE really changes the experience from self-study compared to other things we've seen. I know it involves conversation, right, as a way to deliver content that's a little bit more engaging and human. It's content that's really grounded in real world cases and
Mhm.
dilemmas, so it's also story driven learning, which we've seen can be a format that delivers maybe higher comprehension, right? So
Right.
not only can we deliver a different format, but also can create course content that might be even better retained than our current models. When I compared traditional self-study courses with podcast-based, podcasts can feel a little bit more like mentorship or consultation than instruction. There's clinical nuance. They can go into ethical discussions or lived
Mhm.
experience, applied practice. It's not without limitations, because it is audio based learning. So it's less visual. It's not ideal for highly technical or skill based training that requires demonstration. But I think that there's benefits in there, right? So I want to get your
Yeah.
thoughts, Charlie. What are some of the downsides or limitations to podcast learning? And I discussed a little bit, but are you the type of learner that retains information better through conversation or maybe like
Gotcha.
skill based hands on?
I'm definitely more of a, honestly, it's kind of a mix of both because I enjoy having conversations that open up my mind to new ideas that I had not really thought about before. And honestly, I think the podcast CE does bridge together the traditional, even before like the self study CEs, like going to an actual conference. It
Yes.
merges that conference type of experience where you are getting more of, like you said, the clinical nuance, those more in-depth discussions about certain areas, and it brings in more of that speaker's personal experience versus just being able to read through. So those personal experiences kind of where I live and gain the most education from is really hearing from other people. And while you aren't necessarily able to ask the questions directly, when you're in a workshop setting, you can raise your hand, Q&A and do all that stuff. A lot of times listening to the podcast, people have already come up with questions that people would ask. So I know
Right.
that when we do our summits and things like that, a lot of the questions that are there are things that we've thought about in advance or things that you've
Mhm.
mentioned as a producer, like make sure you kind of ask this question or you already know what things that people are going to wonder about. So it
Mhm.
gives you that level of applied practice without having to schedule and pay for conferences across the country that you may not be able to make it to. reading through those self-study CEs is not my jam at all. If I mean, seriously, if I can do I try to do like larger conferences, maybe those that I can even do from home that are virtual so that I can still get that experience because reading it on my own, my mind will wander. And so just sitting here reading something is not necessarily the way that I learn. Now I do see the importance or the relevance of having things like slides and having those visual things for you to look at. So I
Yes.
do think you kind of miss it there with a podcast CE. But it gives you, I think it would give you a much more open experience and like that person is actually talking to you. You're having an experience and you're learning from someone, not necessarily what you can gather from reading. And if you're a busy person, a busy clinician, not just whether you're a parent or a spouse or whatever, life happens and things are going on around you. And so having that moment to, plug your headphones in, take a walk while you're listening, I think you gain things a bit better or easier,
Mm.
aids in that comprehension that you mentioned before, versus just sitting down reading something or even, flipping to the post test to go back and answer questions, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think you actually may retain the information a bit better and be able to apply it more in your regular life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of interesting when you had mentioned just the action of learning while walking.
Hmm.
I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes I'll listen to podcasts while I'm running around. And
Yeah.
there'll be certain locations where my mind will go back to that content that I've
Yes.
learned.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's very interesting when we can activate our body in that way. We put ourselves in a different mindset for learning. So that too can be sort of a benefit of this delivery.
Absolutely, and even that, I think it not necessarily just the moving or the walking, but even in the commute in your car. I have
Hmm.
found that I listen to a lot of different things while in my car, but and so then when I get back in there, it's like, "Oh,
Yes.
I was thinking about this the last time I was in here.
Hmm.
Where's my mind on this topic now?" Or let me listen to something else that's similar. Like, if I'm
Yes.
listening to something about perimenopause, for example, I may go find something else around that topic because I'm in the car and thinking back, I wanted to know more. Let's look more into that now. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Are you preparing for a licensure exam in psychology, social work, marriage and family therapy, counseling, or behavioral analysis? AATBS is here to help. We have been supporting behavioral and mental health students to prepare for their licensure exams for more than 45 years, working with over 1 million students to succeed on test day and move on to the next step in their career. With products ranging from comprehensive courses to quiz banks and delivered live online, self-study online, and in print, AATBS has test prep solutions that meet every student's needs and learning styles. Visit us today at aatbs.com. That's aatbs.com and use promo code BHT15 to save 15% off your next purchase.
Yeah. Yeah. My brain is locked in the same way. I have very
Mhm,
specific locations where I've been on vacation, where
mhm.
I've listened to a podcast and I'll think of that episode. Like when I think of that episode, I think of that location and vice versa. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
So I know we talked a little bit about who this is for. You talked about how it can be applied by, listening to in your commute for a busy clinician that might need to be doing something else. So that's exactly what I want to kind of hit on here. I think that podcast CEs work especially well for clinicians who've got full caseloads, might
Yeah.
not have time to sit at their computer. Those that might be busy clinicians balancing caregiving or parenting or other
Mhm.
roles. I think that this delivery can fit into busy lives. Also, think of accessibility, those that might live in rural,
Yeah.
geographically isolated areas. See, events might not be accessible. You talked a little bit about virtual ones, right?
Mhm.
That too just increases access to these things. Often think of clinicians with limited access to do live trainings. It doesn't fit your schedule, but this can be also a audio podcast that can be delivered in a similar way. Also, think of
Mhm.
learning styles, right? Those that might not be able to sit at computers for a long period of time, or those that just prefer
Yeah.
audio formats, right? We
Mhm.
talk about how we enjoy podcast listening. On the other side, where podcast based CE courses might not be the best fit, are those that might prefer structured learning or visual learning, right? We
Yeah.
talked about how those are elements that are sort of missed in this delivery. Also, you talked a little bit about how those that might prefer real-time interaction or Q&As with presenters, they
Mhm.
don't get that through podcast-based learning. You won't be able to get any hands-on practice with this type of delivery. So, I want to ask you as we sort of reflect on that, how does accessibility show up in your CE conversations, Shirley? When you're considering CEs that you have to fulfill, how would
Mhm.
you like to see the CE requirements evolve with how clinicians actually live? And what are you sort of taking in consideration when you're choosing? So you mentioned self-study doesn't really fit with your lifestyle.
No. No. And honestly, I really was in a place with CEs before you mentioned this, like, how am I going to get all of the 40 that I need to get? And I have 2 years
Yes.
to get my 40, but how am I going to get all of these 40 in these 2 years on top of life? On
Mhm.
top of, working, full-time job. It is a demanding one. My podcast host duties here. On top of parenting. I have 2 children that are in sports on weekends, being a wife, being a sister, being all of the things that I and a lot of clinicians are. We are a lot of roles all in one. And so I honestly think that the podcast CE meets a lot of those needs that we are trying to fix or trying to reach others. So for me, like I mentioned, the self-study CEs are not for me. They're just not. I'm not necessarily a self-study, self-paced type of person. I don't know that I'm that disciplined. I will be honest. I kind of need a little direction to
Yeah.
lead me, I need some level of interest. And hearing an inflection in somebody's voice shows their interest in the topic. So maybe I'm a bit more interested because I can hear that level of excitement in theirs. I've learned that about myself, through the podcast. When people are very interested and upbeat about their topic, I tend to be more interested and upbeat as well. I appreciate that podcast CEs allow you to search for and choose topics that can better relate to your actual practice. I'd see
Mm.
that a lot in the self-study CEs. You kind of just have to pick some and roll with it, whether it goes with what you need or not, or
Sure.
your level of practice or not. And just the small amount of research I've done into podcast CEs, it seems to give you the availability or access to new topics, and hearing people talk about new things. 'Cause
Mhm.
I feel like that's the idea behind CEs, right? To get new information, maybe from a new area. You're learning things so that you're able to put it into practice. So I think podcast CEs fit that criteria, and I really think that that's where I see the future of CEs going. Can't say that you shouldn't go to a workshop. I personally enjoy them. That is my favorite way to gain knowledge, to gain access to new information, is going to those conferences, because not only do you get those hands-on experiences or conversations, Q&As with presenters, you also get to network with others. What I can see from a CE or what I've taken from a workshop might not necessarily be what you took from it. Hearing from others kind of helps that. So maybe even that's more of the evolution of where it will go. So taking it from, that I listen to this podcast and then making it more into a community where we are
Yes.
talking about the ideas that we have all learned,
Mm.
and not just what I took from it. You can hear from others and how they've applied this information in their real life.
Yeah, no, I love that suggestion. Adding a community element
Hmm.
to our learning can really keep us in track. Having somebody else to learn alongside you helps accountability as well. I've seen some really interesting things on the exam prep side where people are putting together these learning programs
Hmm.
where they're including that social element, the community element, in order
Yes.
to help accountability, to really kind of tap into some of those psychological effects, right? When we're
Hmm.
working alongside somebody and somebody is focused, we too stay focused, right? We don't always have that, in online settings, right?
Right.
But adding a social element to our CE credits can really kind of keep us focused and also engaged, right? Being able to share information and, know that other people are also doing it alongside you. So that would be a
Absolutely.
very neat innovation to that area.
Yeah.
CE accreditation can also feel very confusing.
Hmm.
So I want to, follow up of what should clinicians actually be paying attention to when choosing a podcast for CE credit. So understand that not all CE credits are interchangeable. Each licensure has specific requirements, and because a podcast is being educational doesn't mean that it's accredited. So often providers of podcast-based CE courses will provide details on specific board approvals. So clinicians must verify that the provider is approved by their licensing board and then confirm the topic meets state specific requirements like ethics or cultural competency, suicide prevention, etc. Some platforms will help by offering state requirement checkers and clear accreditation labeling per course. But just understand that boards change rules frequently. So it is
Mhm.
the clinicians that are ultimately responsible for understanding those approvals. So, Shirley, I want to ask you, as somebody who's navigated CE accreditation, what is most
Mhm.
confusing about the accreditation process?
Honestly, Peter, it is all of the things that you just named,
Mm.
right? So specifically for me, just having the technicalities be different for different states. So I
Yes.
am currently licensed in one state, working towards licensure in a different state, but I practice in both of those states at the same time.
Mm.
So trying to get the right CEs that are required for each state. Each one of them has a different requirement level because one state says that you have to have your a certain amount of hours come from a social worker, and the other one
Mm.
doesn't. Or one says you have to have a certain amount of ethics, and one doesn't. And one says you have to have cultural competency, and the other one doesn't. And so for me, just in that it works for this state, but not this one,
Mm.
is where the confusion starts to happen. And so I'm interested to dig deeper into the podcast CEs to see how much I can do for both. Because it almost feels like the hours need to be doubled because it's not necessarily the
Yes.
same
Hmm.
for each state for me. But then that last piece that you just mentioned, which is beyond annoying as a clinician, is that boards change their rules.
Yes.
And they don't always tell us that they change their
Hmm.
rules. And so, I mean, the onus is on us, as the clinician to figure that out. But it can be very difficult to navigate that piece, that changing forecast for us on top of being in two different states at the same time.
Yeah, it is challenging. And the fact
Yep.
that those markers change,
Mhm.
yearly, or as frequently as they do, it
Yep.
also poses challenges for the providers. So I think it really comes down to a responsible, ethical provider that can keep up with those things and be, fruitfully honest about what approvals they can offer. Last thing you want to be doing is promising something that doesn't meet the approval, and then,
Right.
people in that state have some problems.
Right.
So yeah, it can be difficult, but like I said, responsible, efficacious platforms will have that information. Now, if somebody wanted to start earning CE credits from podcasts tomorrow, where would they go? So the credible platforms that I've seen are Clearly Clinical, Cummings Graduate Institute, or they also go by CGI, and then also Psychiatry and Psychotherapy Podcast. The common models that I've seen are subscription-based libraries or annual membership. Now, this ranges from about $60 to $130 a year. And lastly, some of these platforms have free podcast options. So if you're looking to dip your toe into this, you can try those as a format. Now, just to get a little bit deeper into detail, talking specifically about Clearly Clinical, they are APA, ASWB, and NBCC approved. Their format requires post test and evaluation afterwards, and they offer free ECE episodes if you want to try it out. Now, Cummings Graduate Institute, that was another platform. They are ASWB and NBCC accredited, so no APA on that particular platform.
Okay.
They offer affordable membership, and then they too include free CE options if that's something you want to try out. And then lastly, the Psychiatry and Psychotherapy Podcast. This is specifically for medical professionals, so those looking for AMA, PRA Category 1 credits. And their program follows the Continuing Medical Education, or CME, quiz model. Those are just a couple platforms that I've seen that looked efficacious. And so understand that listening alone is not enough. So in order to, you must enroll or register on their platform, listen to an approved episode, and then complete the quiz and evaluation. And upon that completion, you'll download and save the certificate. That's sort of the process there. So, Charlie, as you've heard me speak today, how might you recommend clinicians build sustainable CE plan using podcasts?
Honestly, I think the first step of that is to start planning ahead.
Mm.
Um, I know that the year flies by. I say because I know I do it too. The years fly by, and you get to December, and you're like, "Oh my god, I need these hours, and I need them yesterday." But building a plan is going to be important. So looking towards what you need for next year, maybe even
Mhm.
starting to look into what your board is currently requiring for that next licensure period. What courses do you need to actually take? And then start to digging in or really figure yourself out before you even dig into what's available. Figure out what works best for you. So are you a workshop based person? Do you need to talk with your employer about paying for, you to go to a conference? Do you need to go to a virtual conference so that it is more cost effective? Are you one that is great with self-study stuff? Are you somebody who can listen to something and gain the information just from somebody talking? So I think really knowing yourself, being very self-aware about what you need in the process and what is really going to be helpful for you in your role or your current role or where you plan to go next. Then once you figured out those things, sit and figure out how you can obtain them. I'm like I
Mhm.
said, I'm already starting to look at which conferences are available in my area, as well as ones that I can do virtually and ones that my employer might pay for. Trying to maximize all of the benefits available for one at work, as well as making sure that you as a person are getting the things that you need from your job. Now that I know more about CE podcasts, I'm going to start looking on these websites because this clearly clinical seems very interesting. I want to try it out just to see. So now that I know that there are free options out there, I didn't want to sign up for, this yearly membership and never do it. So now that I know that there are free options for you to try out and see, I think it's an opportune time. I mean, we are coming, at the beginning of the year when this will air, you're at the beginning of that period and you can kind of play around to see with what things are going to work for you moving
Mhm.
forward. So again, I think figuring out your plan early, not waiting to the last minute, having some self awareness about what is going to work for you, because nothing is worse than having to sit on December the 28th and read hundreds of pages of,
Yeah.
self study CE stuff. I've been there. This is how I
Right.
know. And it was due on the 31st. And I had no choice. Gotta do what you gotta do. But if when you know better, you have to do better. So making
Yeah.
sure that you're planning ahead and explore all your options. I really thought that there was really only one or two good ways to get CEs. So this has opened up my mind, and I hope it does for listeners as well, to what is available, what's really out there, and how you can gain information in other ways.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate you outlining the process that goes into preparing for your CEs, knowing that podcast based CEs could be an option. So, at the end of the day, continuing education courses aren't optional, but how we earn them can be. Podcast based CEs is about meeting clinicians where they're already at. They're in their cars, they're out on walks, they're between sessions, they're in the midst of real life. And it's not a replacement from every form of training, but it is a flexible and engaging option that can make continuing education feel more manageable and maybe just a little bit more enjoyable. Looking ahead into 2026, one of my hopes is being able to offer more value to clinicians by exploring ways and to turn content of this podcast into CE approved courses. So that's something that we're actively working toward. But if there's one key takeaway, it's this: that the learning you're already doing may be closer to counting than you think. With the right platform, proper accreditation, and a bit of intention, those everyday listening moments can become legitimate professional development without adding more to your plate. So, thank you very much for joining me today on our episode of BHT Bytes, and I look forward to seeing you all next time on Behavioral Health Today. We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Tried Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.